Good morning, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to USIP. Thanks for coming. My name is John Temin. I'm the director of our program on the Horn of Africa here at USIP. My first order of business is to ask everybody to please turn off your cell phones. Let me also welcome the folks who are watching this via the webcast online. Thank you very much for joining us. I also want to thank my colleague Sheldon Himmelfarb, who's in the audience here, for helping to pull this together, and with his Center on Media and Peace Building, they've been very much a partner in helping to make this happen. So we do a lot of events here at USIP that focus on some negative things and violence and conflict, so it's really nice to be able to get together to talk about something that seemed to go rather peacefully and something that seemed to work, and that, of course, were the recent national elections in Kenya. We also do a lot of work here on conflict prevention and trying to advance the conflict prevention agenda globally. And so we think it's really important to try to look, when these instances of apparent conflict prevention happen, to try to look at why that is, and to try to unpack those apparent successes, and to try to see if there are some lessons from those that can be applied more globally. And so we thought it would be a great opportunity to get together some experts to talk about those Kenya elections and to see why we think they went so well and to see what might be applicable even further than Kenya. So we have a really good group of people to do that today. 3 people who are with us from Nairobi, so have been living through this process for a while. You should have the bios in front of you, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to introduce them, we have John Langwa, who is the Kenya country representative for the USAID Office of Transition Initiatives. His colleague Sam Kona, who's a conflict management specialist with USAID in Kenya. Rachel Brown, who's the founder and CEO of Sisi Niamani in Kenya, and she'll go into details on what that is. And my colleague Jackie Wilson from USIP, who has spent a lot of time living in and working on Kenya. We also have a lot of expertise in the audience, and so we're going to pull from that as the morning goes on. So I've asked each of our speakers to be pretty brief in making some opening remarks, 5-7 minutes or so we can make sure we have plenty of time for some dialogue amongst us and some dialogue with the audience. So we'll go down the row here, starting with John. Thanks again for coming, and please, John.
Thanks. Thanks, John, and I want to thank USIP for giving us this venue today to talk about this particular issue. It was very much in sort of my interest as I read about the post-election analysis and why there was apparent calm and peace in Kenya, to actually begin to address and kind of break down a bit about why things stayed as calm as they were. I know that within this room there's an extreme amount of experience and knowledge about the country, going way back, so I don't need to do quite a bit of a historical review of sort of what has occurred. But from sort of my point of view and the reason that things were probably as stable as they were, we have to go back and take a look at 2007, 2008, which is basically sort of the key point in kind of almost everything in Kenya's history right now and how things are beginning to progress. For those of you who sort of watched the news and knew what was going on in Kenya at the time, 2007, the end of 2007, an election was held. The way the election was conducted created a situation in which the losers could perceive that they somehow had it stolen or taken from them. And then a lot of the rhetoric that occurred after that led to sort of a spiral of violence that then ended up in about a little over 1,000 people dead and roughly 500,000 people forced into IDP status. It was the aftermath of that was sort of the extraordinary thing, because rather than kind of just sort of papering everything over and kind of moving beyond it, there was a peace agreement that was worked out with heavy involvement of the international community. Kofi Annan was called in. He was sort of the main person that oversaw the process. And what we ended up with was a peace agreement that was signed on February 28th, 2008, that created and put sort of 2 things into place that have fundamentally changed the way Kenya operates today. And at the first level, there was an incredible amount of energy and momentum for looking at and trying to examine the reasons why there was so much violence, to try to determine who was responsible for that, and to try to find out, or to try to figure out how we can find some sort of accountability for that. And so it ended up creating one commission in particular, led by a justice of the appellate court, actually the head justice, Justice Waukee, who created a commission report that was about a Pepto-Bismol colored report that was about yay thick in the investigation of the violence, which, along with that, in this rather at this stage sort of proverbial brown envelope of names, which was sort of close hold but supposedly listed the people that were most responsible for the violence, was held for a while the Kenyan parliament debated and decided whether it was going to create a tribunal to actually hold the potential perpetrators to account. The parliament never got around to that, between backbenchers and frontbenchers and everybody else sort of working on whether this kind of thing would actually happen. No tribunal took place, and then these sort of triggers, then the peace agreement sort of were set off, so that the brown envelope ended up going from Justice Waukee to Kofi Annan, and then eventually to Moreno Ocampo, who was the prosecutor at the time for the International Criminal Court. The interesting thing about that particular piece is that I very much believe that it was the ICC pressures and the then subsequent indictments of several people that ended up leading to 5 years later, prior to the election, the Jubilee Alliance, which was effectively an alliance of multiple political parties, but at its core were the political parties that were representing Kikuyu and Kalenjin interests, and these were represented by Uhuru Kenyatta, who is now the president of the country, and William Ruto, who's the deputy vice president. It was, and for those of you who do know Kenyan history to a large extent, violence in '92, violence in '97, and then again, especially what occurred in 2000 to 2008. In the main, the violence is Kalenjin on Kikuyu and vice versa, and it was the Jubilee Alliance. It was largely driven by the ICC indictments that effectively neutralized the KK violence, so that in the Rift Valley in particular, where most of the violence has taken place, most of that potential for violence was taken off the table, and we didn't have it. It's at the other there's another level, though, at which that peace agreement then ended up leading to momentum for peace, that a lot of us, and those of us who work for USAID and a lot of other institutions involved in sort of real change in Kenya over the last 5 years, had at least some real, I think, and solid, meaningful role. And that was the whole element of the peace agreement that created the basis for major political reform and governance change in the country. And there was Agenda 4, there were other components of the peace agreement that basically led Kenya on a process to write and adopt a new constitution. And it's the components of these constitutions that have represented the greatest change in governance in the country since independence. And right now, everybody right now in Kenya is sort of scrambling for how this devolution process is supposed to take place, in which there are now 47 county governments and new governors and new county assemblies, and there's just a radical overhaul at the moment. But what's most important about that entire aspect of the peace agreement and the reform that it put Kenya on with regards to violence was that it helped create, I think, in the Kenyan public, and I think there are a lot of Kenyans who would agree with this, and I'm going to pass it on to Sam in just a moment to be able to talk about this, some real increasing confidence in how the country is governed and how the institutions of the government of Kenya can be relied on rather than going towards violence. So when on March 9, when the announcement was made by the IEBC as to who won and how much, there was this large announcement where Raila Odinga was then told essentially that he had lost to Jubilee interests by 8,000 votes out of 12 million, which put it out of a runoff and into a first-round victory for Jubilee. Raila's immediate reaction, based on all kinds of things that occurred during the vote tabulation and the run-up to that tabulation, was such that he believed that the election was sort of stolen from them. He made that clear in a statement. But then, instead of using words that were used in 2007, 2008, the two words mass action are sort of the most famous on that, in that he chose to say, I do not want any of you to protest. I don't want any violence. And because we're going to court, and the only way to be able to go to court is through, is making sure that things do not get violent. So we actually had a situation where if the ICC indictments themselves are to be believed, that is, the big political leaders have control over their populations to be able to either commit them to violence or not to. Ryla's role at that stage in sort of keeping people off the street was sort of a major reason why things were quiet. So those are sort of the main reasons that I sort of see things staying quiet in Kenya. However, there is a lot, as many of you know, a tremendous amount of work that was done in the last 3 to 6 months and around the election itself to try to keep things quiet, to try to monitor what was happening. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Sam, if I may, to discuss some of those things.
Thank you, John. Let me also thank the United States Institute for Peace for creating this opportunity to discuss why the Kenyan elections were peaceful this time. And I recognize the fact that it is a unique departure from what the world is used to, because often when things are peaceful, we tend to forget them fast, because peace is not as sensational as violence. And for Kenya in particular, it's important to discuss why the elections were peaceful, because it somehow defied some of the negative predictions that came just before the elections, that perhaps Kenya was heading back to another dangerous stage in its life. And the predictions, of course, were not unjustified, considering that these elections that Kenya was going into were the most complex in the history of the country. Of course, significantly, the first one under the new constitution. And you expected the legacy of 2007, 2008 to inform those kind of predictions. But we are also aware that the elections, the outcome of the elections was contested. And bearing in the fact that the last elections we had violence, then that contestation over the outcome obviously will have predisposed Kenya to some form of violence or the other. But I want to submit that the significance of the peaceful nature of the elections in Kenya this time did not take place accidentally. This was a culmination of a national process of self-reflection that began in 2008 upon the signing of the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation Accord. So we got the peace in 2013 because of what happened between 2008 and 2013. And one of the significant things that made Kenya to defy that negative prediction is the fact that Kenya got a new constitution that unleashed a process where we engaged in serious reforms that directly tackled the triggers of the violence in 2008, but also attempted to address the underlying causes of violence that is always associated with elections in Kenya. So the processes that Kenya engaged in from 2008, with the constitution as the overarching framework, is what made the context in 2013 radically different from 2008, yet the circumstances could be more or less similar in terms of those factors that could have led to violence, including the behavior of the Electoral Commission during the tallying and announcement of results. There was some close resemblance to 2007. The fact that the outcome, as I've already mentioned, was contested, and of course you expected a similar reaction as that one of 2007. What the new constitution did and the various other processes that Kenya engaged in was to create a completely different political and institutional framework within Kenya when we were going for the 2013 elections. And it is significant to note that the peaceful nature of the referendum in 2010 that culminated in the new constitution was a major development in terms of Kenyans going to a competitive, a divisive, and potentially violent process. So the experience of going through a competitive process from the 2007 experience was not these elections. For me, the experience of the referendum also informed the behavior of Kenyans when the elections were conducted. The new constitution created institutions in Kenya so that by the time the elections in 2013 were approaching, the confidence of Kenyans, especially in the Electoral Commission and the judiciary, I will say, were very high. They had trust that these institutions will deliver a fair process. They had confidence that should there be a dispute, the same constitution had created institutions for dispute resolution, with the Supreme Court being the summit of all those institutions. So there was confidence that even if the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission and other electoral dispute mechanisms that were established under the new constitution will not deliver, there was still another peaceful result, and that was the Supreme Court. And as John has pointedly said, despite the fact that Raila Odinga did not accept the outcome, I want to say that the experience of 2007 and the fact that there was a rigorous process of establishing these institutions and structures, even the political leadership in Kenya, including Raila Odinga, I bet, were compelled to use the existing institutions before resorting to other mechanisms. So this was a national process of building institutions that people could rely on as opposed to resorting to mass action and, of course, the subsequent violence that often accompanies it. So that is one significant factor that will go down in history as contributing to the peaceful nature of these elections in Kenya. Linked to that, and equally important, I will say, is the peace-building community in Kenya was gifted through the Jubilee Alliance. And I think John has alluded to that. The Jubilee Alliance that brought together historically two communities who have been at the center of violence, especially during elections, from 1992 to 2007. I would say they were gifted because the circumstances that led to the formation of the Jubilee Alliance may not have been entirely driven by the desire for peace, although the Jubilee Alliance did speak about peace through all their campaigns and also in their manifesto. But the fact that the two communities came together minimized the risk of the repeat of 2007, 2008 violence significantly. And I think the coming of the two also reduced the number of potential hotspots that could potentially have been there in Kenya. And although most people may not like to speak it, I think the coming together of Uhuru and Ruto, and especially the two communities, there was also a convergence of one of them wanting to return to power, that is the Kalenjin, and the other one wanting to retain power. Knowing that from the 2002 experience, most of the Kalenjins who are in public service lost their jobs, and they attributed that to the Kibaki and therefore the Kikuyu administration for them. So there was a big desire that they needed to retain, to come back to power, and of course that one came together with Uhuru Kenyatta's community also wanting to retain power, which was, of course, a good thing for peace in Kenya. And I think if you consider also the circumstances that surrounded the elections, and especially on the Jubilee Alliance, I submit that the Jubilee Alliance came to this election as an underdog, And I think that one minimized the possibility of anybody organizing violence because they thought perhaps the Jubilee Alliance may not win. There are so many things, from the ICC indictment challenges to the propaganda that was going around Kenya that Kenya was not ready for another Kikuyu president, including the opinion polls, which consistently showed that the Jubilee Alliance was behind. So for the CORD people, I think there was an element of complacency because they couldn't see how Jubilee would win, and that perhaps might have reduced the possibility of violence because nobody was seeing that there was any visible loss to that extent. So that's why I'm saying the Jubilee Alliance came as a gift to the peace-building community in Kenya by minimizing the hotspots and also bringing the communities that have been at the center of violence for a long time together. But I also want to say over the last 5 years, there has been serious work that has been done in terms of sustained dialogue, especially at the community level across Kenya. This was mainly driven by the government of Kenya through the district peace committees, the civil society organization and the religious groups that conducted various forms of dialogue to make sure Kenya recovers from the effect of the 2007 post-election violence, but also to create the platform for groups to begin to discuss their grievances and possibly forge ways in which they could resolve them. And I remember, for example, just before the referendum, the Peace Caravan, for example, in Kenya, conducted various peace dialogue processes from almost all parts of Kenya to make sure that the referendum was peaceful, to make sure that people understood that there could not be a better way for Kenya to move forward except embracing dialogue and resorting to peaceful means rather than to violence. So by the time the 2013 elections were approaching, the platform for dialogue, the consciousness for resort to peaceful mechanisms of peace, of conflict management, and of course the awareness of what the trauma that caused by the 2007-2008 post-election violence was alive in Kenya. And I think all the efforts that came towards the election, including the early warning and early response system that were established by different groups, the peace messaging that came through different mechanisms, had a friendly environment that was created over a sustained period of 5 years where communities were engaged in either reconstructing the destroyed livelihood or reconstructing their relationships, and of course trying to forge a future that all of them will share and all of them will feel secure about. And I just want to say that apart from those sustained dialogues and interventions by civil society, government, communities, and other groups, this particular election also benefited immensely from the behavior of the security forces. Just before the elections, the Inspector General of Police proactively deployed almost 100,000 police officers to different parts of Kenya, but particularly to 33,000 polling stations across Kenya. That kind of proactive deployment and the actual presence of police officers on the ground sent a message to everyone in Kenya that somebody was watching. Things are not going to be the same as in 2007, 2008. And I will say, to some degree, that proactive deployment by the police did contribute to the peaceful nature of the elections, either through deterrence or the actual response, especially with the link between the early warning community and the relationship with the police. And of course, linked to the issue of security forces, one other thing that the new constitution did, which is linked to the ICC process also, is the fact that in 2013, if you are planning to incite openly, using open inflammatory statements, or using statements that will be regarded as hate speech, there was utmost vigilance among its different segments of the Kenyan population in monitoring, tracking, and reporting cases of hate speech. And of course, knowing that there were serious and senior Kenyans that were facing charges at the ICC, and most of the Kenyans knew there were people who were tracking and monitoring, it was very difficult to openly incite Kenyans, as the case was in 2007, 2008. And that, of course, removed one serious trigger of conflict in Kenya over the last many years, because it tackles directly the question of the culture of impunity and so forth. I want to end by also acknowledging the fact that within those 5 years, from 2008 to 2013, Kenyans invested in training the media on conflict-sensitive reporting. And I think when the electoral process started, when there were challenges in the transmission of the results and so forth, I will say the Kenyan media also contributed in a major way to the peaceful nature of the elections by being responsible in their reporting and, of course, highlighting the peaceful nature and the significance of peace messaging across Kenya. So those are the factors that I will say contributed to these peaceful elections. And as has already been pointed out, all of them draw their spirit, draw their life from the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation Accord, which paved way for the new constitution, and of course the different electoral, institutional, and other forms of reforms Kenya engaged in, which created the right context for the elections to be peaceful, including for the losing candidate to embrace the use of court as opposed to street protest. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel.
Great, thanks, Sam. I think that John and Sam have talked about a lot of larger structural factors that contributed to a peaceful 2013 election. And I'm going to talk a little bit more from a grassroots perspective and start out by giving a bit of background on what Sisi Niamani does. So we are a grassroots Kenyan NGO. And what we've done is really look at and focus on the role that communication plays in conflict. Kenya had post-election violence, as I think a lot of us know, in 92 and in 97. What was unique about 2007 and 2008 was the degree to which this spread throughout the country and also the magnitude. And one thing that happened in 2007 and in 2008 is that there were now mobile phones. And this made it a lot easier to spread information about violence much more quickly. And mobile phones, and in particular text messaging, were really used to spread rumors, including the "they're coming to get us" type of rumors, to spread hate speech and fear, and even to organize for weapons distributions and attacks and tell people to prepare. Sisi Niamani started out by working with really local peace activists in different communities and identifying some of the barriers that they had faced in their own efforts in 2007 and in 2008 to combat a lot of the violence that was going on and to combat the negative information flows that were leading people to suspect each other and making their perceptions of each other more negative. So when we analyzed this, we really identified the mobile phone as a place to start. And we looked at how we could essentially build the capacity of local peace actors and peace activists to use this medium to reach people more quickly and more effectively than those who would wish to promote violence. So we designed an SMS-based platform to which community members can subscribe. And we focused our efforts mainly in Nairobi, in an area called Eastlands, and in parts of the Rift Valley. And we're able to partner with a lot of different government institutions as well as Kenya's largest mobile phone provider, service provider, Safaricom, to be able to get the messages that we needed. So at the time of the election, we had about 65,000 people who had subscribed to this platform. They would opt in and give us their demographic information so that everyone in the system, we would know their location, the language they wished to receive messages in, their gender, and their age. So we were able to send essentially like an e-list, really targeted messages out, but directly to people's phones as events were unfolding. So this let us work with local peace actors to get messaging out in real time in a really targeted way in response to events on the ground. We set up a monitoring network. We had coordinators from the areas in every area where we worked, and networks of partners. And we really proactively monitored what was going on so that we could not only do conflict prevention messaging, but also provide needed civic education. Things like which type of identification to bring to the polling booth and what to expect when you got there so that people could really know what was going on around them. We created our messages in partnership with the community, and in doing this, we had focus groups with a lot of different demographic groups, including young men who had participated in violence, or people in the transport industry or selling things on the side of the road who participate in the spread of rumors and information in the community. And we had identified certain types of drivers and barriers to behavior, in particularly working with people who had participated in the post-election violence. Some of the things that they brought up as effective messaging included loss from violence. And I think it's really important that in this election, the memory of 2007 and 2008 was very fresh. People experienced incredible loss. Even people who participated in the violence often ended up regretting it. They thought that they would gain money from it. A lot of them were never paid, and a lot of them experienced an increase in prices, a lack of mobility resulting from the violence, so they didn't really get the benefits that they had hoped. And a lot of them also felt manipulated, so a lot of our messaging also had to do with avoiding manipulation and really calling on that memory of regret and feeling manipulated and like violence wasn't an effective solution. And then, of course, there was also messaging about a unifying identity and responsibility, but responsibility for peace in your community. So I think, based on the research that we did, these were things that we expected to be very effective. And a lot of the feedback that we've gotten has pointed to that. I think people were really afraid of experiencing what they experienced in 2007 and in 2008. And I think that that's a really important piece of this, probably all the way from the political level down to the grassroots, is that people saw what they had to lose and how bad it could get, and they didn't want it to repeat. A way in which the messaging was effective that we didn't anticipate, but that we've been learning about through monitoring and evaluation that we're doing through phone-based surveys of random subscribers, is that people keep talking about this idea that they were being watched, and it spans across a variety of situations, ranging from, I'll give a couple of quotes here from people that we've called. One man said, "People would ask each other if they had received the messages, and this in a way made people feel like they were being watched, and thus they didn't involve themselves in violence." And this is a piece of feedback we got over and over again, is that when people were grouping and unhappy about what was going on and starting to say, well, what should we do? Should we take action? And they would receive a message, they were saying, who's watching us? Who can see us here? But it also worked in a couple of other ways. We've also gotten feedback that people felt more secure and relaxed. Another quote, "I felt like someone was in control and watching." And so this person said that they felt like everything was going to be okay. And then a third thing is that we've gotten some feedback that by getting the messages, people felt empowered and more confident to also go and promote peace. So we had a lot of people saying, I felt good about getting the messages because I could forward them to my friends that I knew might be involving themselves in bad situations. A woman said, "It helped me have the courage to preach peace." And I think that this is all really important, not only for our work, but in general. I think there was a lot of work done to really look at who is doing great things at the grassroots level and how can we support them. And I think that that's a really important way to think about things, because every community, every area is very different. And there are always people in communities, including in 2007 and in 2008, who are working to promote peace, even when it's against the odds and at great risk to themselves. So the angle that we've taken is how can we support these individuals and make their voices heard more loudly and more effective. And I think for us, we coordinated with some national level institutions. We coordinated with the National Steering Committee. So when our team was reporting things on the ground, we were able to report it to that body, which sits in the office of the president and coordinates early warning and response. And we were able to get a response on the ground pretty quickly. And so I think that in 2007 and 2008, there was this vacuum where you could have chaos and people felt like they could do whatever they wanted without a consequence. We saw people getting ready for that this time in one slum area called Madari, we were getting reports the day of the election. People started grouping in all the common areas where you would loot, because they were hoping if there's chaos, they were ready to go and steal as much as they could, right? And it didn't happen, but there was that, because there wasn't that vacuum where opportunists could take advantage of chaos to do whatever they wanted, whether it's take your neighbor's house, live without rent for a little while longer, or just go into a convenience store and take what you want. And I think that that lack of vacuum really stemmed from the grassroots being more connected to national level institutions making an effort to connect to the grassroots, and really the amplification of those voices. I think the other thing I would say is that people really did choose not to fight. There were a lot of structural factors that made it less likely, but there also was a lot of tension. We saw in between the filing of cases and the Supreme Court decision in parts of Nairobi, our team was describing it as a Cold War. People refused to buy from people from the other coalitions. It got in one area so that the motorcycles, which serve as taxis, put new reflectors on with red and orange, which were the two coalition colors, so that you wouldn't take a taxi of the wrong coalition, essentially, right? And there were still the type of rumors going around that if this group wins, we won't pay rent anymore. If that group wins, we're going to double the rent, right? These kinds of threats going around. So there was a lot of tension present, but people really did choose not to fight, despite feeling maybe that they had reason to. And I think it's important to really understand, why did people choose that? And I think that they were very supported on all levels to choose not to fight, and also to choose to actively promote peace. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Jackie.
Actually, there's not much left to say, because I think all three of you have hit on points that I wanted to make. So I just wanted to come at this from a slightly different perspective, and that is reflecting back to the week before the elections. We knew that there were verified signs of tensions, and I think Sam referred to that. There were marking of houses, there were stockpiles of weapons, there were indicators that there may have been plans in place for people who had an interest in using violence. We know that there's a history of electoral violence in that case. We know that there can be a tendency for electoral violence to recur. And we also knew that there were unresolved issues from 2007, 2008. So I think the question is not just why the elections were peaceful, but what specific things happened to break that decision process, to intervene, so that actors who may have had plans in place did the cost-benefit analysis and decided not to use violence, so made that choice, as Rachel said. So I tried to look at this in terms of structural issues first, and of course we've heard about many of these. We've heard about the Constitution, and just to be dramatic here, I think the part that struck me is the beginning of the Constitution of Kenya that says all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya. And I honestly think the people of Kenya believe in this Constitution. And that was something that was an overarching umbrella, I think, that gave people faith and confidence to make the choice for peace, that the Constitution protects them in some way. Some of you mentioned Government of Kenya structures, the National Steering Committee, the NCIC, and others. There were cases, I think, in the run-up to the election where there was some competition, some disagreement about what roles and responsibilities fell where, about budgeting issues, about mandates, and that sort of thing, but those issues were resolved. And so structurally, for large measure, the Government of Kenya, stepped up and played a role in terms of taking the action structurally that were needed to circumvent electoral violence. We've talked about the judiciary and the vetting process and the confidence that created in the new Supreme Court again. Also devolution that we haven't touched on much, but again, it's a structural issue embedded in the Constitution. It's a complete transformation of government in Kenya, and I think this gave people in the more rural areas some hope. And I think that there's something to look into, is the extent to which, because there was pre-election violence in several counties. We were talking earlier about the Barangay violence, the Tana River violence. And so, I think we can explore the extent to which devolution in this new county structure actually prevented that more localized county level violence from impacting at the national level, in addition to the Kikuyu-Kalenjin alliance in the Rift Valley. Also, I think the police have been, an recognized force in terms of the structural changes. I think are not complete in the police, as I understand it. They're ongoing, but clearly something changed because the police were playing a constructive role in terms of breaking that cycle, that continuum between actors who may have intended to use violence and then chose not to. And so I think that's a very constructive effort. In terms of processes, what I saw happening in Kenya this time was the continuum from analysis to action was much more robust and well thought about and much more complex. So in terms of connections between counties or local level initiatives to national level initiatives. So we talked about the organizational disputes and how those were resolved. The early warning, early response connections. Now, not everything was consistent. There were some, mechanisms that were sort of outside the national level structure and others that were inside the Uwiano national level structure. But for the most part, those processes worked in a complementary nature as opposed to a competitive nature, I think. And so what you had was a much more robust early warning, early response system than you might have had otherwise. And I think that contributed to violence, not to breaking that cycle, that continuum. The NCIC and the monitoring of hate speech, but also these local level monitoring processes, again, that people felt that they were being watched and there was a possibility of accountability, that there were some small attempts at prosecuting or bringing people up on charges for hate speech during the course of the election, I think kept certain actors on their toes. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't hate speech, but I think that, again, helped sway that balance somewhat. And also in terms of processes, the capacity building processes across the board in terms of civic education, which I never think there's enough civic education, but in this case, there were initiatives right up until the last moment. Capacity building of the peace committees, capacity building in civil society, just across the spectrum. And then I looked at the actors, the choices that were made by the individual actors, of course, Uhuru and Ruto deciding to form the political alliance, and there were other, there was talk of negotiated democracy at the county level in certain areas. Whether those are sustainable or not will come to be seen, but the fact that these were negotiated agreements and not fought out on the streets, I think is important choices by the actors. The media programs that we've already talked about, I think were profound and very successful, but I was disappointed to see, I think, Ochuguzi shut down within days after the court case was announced. And, I went to look to see what was happening after that, and it was gone. So I'll come back to that point later. The voters, the citizens, civil society across the board taking actions to mitigate, to break that cycle, as such as the work that Rachel and others were doing. We haven't really talked about the business sector, and I think it's not clear what role they played, except that they were there behind the scenes. And I think the message that Kenyans lost so much after the electoral violence, and certainly the humanitarian aspects, the deaths and suffering, the displacements, but also economically. Some of the numbers we've looked at are in the billions. $6 billion worth of GDP, perhaps, that was just wiped away from the Kenyan economy. And so the role of the business sector, I think, remains to be explored. The international engagement, and I think John mentioned this, and that is that the fact that the international engagement was from 2007 2008 through the constitution building process, the referendum process, and then on into the elections, I think had an immeasurable impact because, again, even though there was this surge 3 to 6 months before the elections, there were people on the ground continuously. There was programming like OTIs, and again, I think that when we reflect forward, we have to think about how fragile these structural changes, how fragile these decision-making processes of these actors could be if we don't continue that. So I think I'll stop there and wait for questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to ask a few follow-up questions. Let me also invite people in the audience, if you want to ask a question, we have these 2 microphones here, and so you can line up behind them and we'll start getting through questions as well. I want to follow up on a few of these things. Looking at this from a conflict prevention lens, we're talking about this as a success, right? There was some sort of conflict coming and something happened to prevent it. But I think there's actually another couple ways to look at it. One is that some of the warnings were actually overhyped. That maybe the threat was not as great as we thought it was. Another possibility is that the can was essentially kicked down the road. This process went well, but a lot of the underlying tensions and grievances were not really addressed, and that they're still there. So I wonder if any of you are interested in sort of unpacking those alternatives. Are those things credible, or is this truly a real instance of the conflict was coming and we did something to avoid it?
I'm happy to start and
Yeah.
turn it over. I think as soon as, and I sort of emphasize and mention the sort of the heavy role that the KK Alliance or the Jubilee Alliance played in suppressing the violence and sort of taking that element of conflict off the table. Up until that actual alliance, and it was upon their return, the mutual return of the president and now deputy president from The Hague, in which it was clear their alliance was sort of coming up. But up until that happened, I think the hype for potential violence was still very true and legitimate for everyone. But as soon as we hit that, then all of a sudden everything sort of changed and flipped over. Then we were dealing with other kinds of violence, which quite frankly occurred in a lot of places. It was mentioned earlier, we had issues in Tana River, we had a massacre of dozens of police in Baragoy. We've then had a lot of violence after the election. In Western and Bungoma in particular, we've had dozens killed in lots of villages. There's been lots of sort of scattered violence around, but we've never had any sort of real national level violence. It was the kind that would shut the economy down and those sorts of things. So I do believe that we had some legitimate hyping prior to that alliance, but after the fact, I think we were continuing on that sort of a treadmill of kind of worrying about it maybe too much. And it's very hard when you're in that kind of situation where everybody's worried about sort of the nuclear meltdown scenario of a repeat of 07, 08, to then tell everybody to back off. You really can't do that, because the last thing you want is for a country to sort of go into free fall like it did before. And so all of the elements of work that went into it, I think, were very important at the time, but it was very clear, I think, that the risk did substantially reduce after that point.
Yeah, I just want to add that it's true there are still serious grievances or underlying problems within Kenya. And it's important to underscore the fact that what we are talking about was a peaceful election, and it should not be confused with peace in Kenya. There are serious issues that need to be addressed, and considering that the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission never delivered as per the expectations of Kenya, this is a real opportunity for Kenya and the leadership in Kenya to come up with a serious reconciliation agenda. The fact that we had a peaceful election gives us, as a country, an opportunity to properly address those historical grievances and tackle those difficult issues that might have been hard to engage in the past, and possibly go through a proper transitional justice process. In terms of the early warning and early response systems that were established, I just want to add that one of the biggest challenges to those early warning and early response mechanisms that were established in Kenya was that they are more driven by incidents taking place as opposed to the ability to detect the emergence or the development of those events before they erupt. So as we go forward, there's need to realign those early warning and early response systems so that they are able to detect the development of a situation and not the explosion of it as they are currently done. And that is why, for example, from Tana River to Baragoi to Mandera, Bungoma, and possibly, I don't know which other destination next, the systems are set up in a way that they report what happens and not what is likely to happen. So that is one adjustment that needs to be done. We can't say they were overhyped because knowing where Kenya was in 2007, 2008, it was far much better to exaggerate it as opposed to not saying it. I think that was the trade-off this time around.
Yeah, I think I do think that there's a lot of structural factors that made violence much less likely and less of a possibility. And even if there had been violence, it would have been very different because you wouldn't have seen it across the Rift Valley. The lines of conflict really, or at least the lines of tension, it didn't really turn into conflict, really changed. And I think that that's really important to remember. And I also think because there was, it was kind of a complicated process, right? There was going to be a first round victory or a runoff or a rerun at some point potentially. If there was going to be violence, there wasn't really a risk of it until someone's last chance, right? Either the court case or the runoff or the rerun. And I do think that there also is an element of, like Sam is saying, these underlying issues still exist. We did see people moving from where they lived before the election. And that wasn't because there was violence or they were being forced to. It was because they were afraid. We saw really high levels of tension between the initial announcement of results and the Supreme Court ruling, particularly in slums in Nairobi, to the extent that people weren't talking to their friends that supported other coalitions. And like I said, were changing their economic patterns and calling it a Cold War, that they were going to freeze, this group out. And that's not really a healthy level of tensions that you want to have in a community. But at the same time, I do think, I'll say again, I think that the memory of 07-08 was a really powerful thing that deterred individuals from participating. I think people were much more afraid of and aware of what could happen and the potential extent of it. But I do think that because that piece was kept, there's an opportunity now to address some of these underlying issues, because it shouldn't be that every time there's an election there's concern that there's violence, and that depending on how the coalitions go, we're going to think that there could be or there won't be. And I think that with devolution as well, there's a big opportunity to take some of the heat off of it and reduce the stakes of one group or another group winning an election. And Jackie mentioned this, I'll just say it again, I also think that the whole devolution process really changed the game as well, because you didn't just have a president, now you had a lot of other positions that really mattered. And the areas where we saw a lot of tension as well in the Rift Valley is where a particular group felt that they had lost the presidency, the governorship, and the senator position as well.
Well, in addition to all of that, some of the work that we've done related to analysis of indicators, and John asked about the hype. We did some a workshop just before the elections with civil society members from Kisumu, Eldoret, Nakuru, and Nairobi. And from their perspective, the indicators were there, and so we tried to help them analyze, for example, if there are stockpiles of weapons, hate speech, and other kind of, different indicators like domestic violence increasing. All of these indicators themselves need to be better understood. For example, what is the strength of knowledge or awareness of stockpiles of weapons? Do you know this because you saw it yourself? Do you know this because somebody you trust saw it themselves firsthand, or do you know it because you just heard about it from somebody, a family member, or you heard it at the marketplace? So there's further analysis that needs to be done of the strength of those particular indicators, and then connecting the indicators to the triggers. For example, at what point, in Kisumu, for example, the civil society suspected that a heavy police deployment which acted in a biased manner could be the trigger that would set off violence in Kisumu. Well, it actually had a heavy police deployment, but it did not serve directly as a trigger of violence. And so I just think that there's a lot more analysis that needs to be done in terms of understanding better those indicators and the connections in terms of how they could escalate. One of the other things we talked about was linking, for example, indicators and actions that happened in areas of the Rift, in Nakuru, for example, or in Kisumu, and how those might connect to, for example, communities in different areas of Nairobi, and how violence might theoretically escalate. So I think there's much more work to be done to really understand what is hype and what is reality.
So let's go to the questions. We'll try to take 2 or 3 people at a time. Please introduce yourself when you ask your question, and try to keep it brief, please.
I'm Gregory Stanton. I'm president of Genocide Watch and also a professor at George Mason University in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. What is striking to me in your discussion, and of course I've lived in Africa for many years, is the gradual movement since 2007 from what you could call the rule of force toward the rule of law. I had a professor at Yale Law School who said there were 4 elements to law. First, law has to be made by authoritative deciders, the legislature or some other, that's the new Constitution. Secondly, it has to be of general application, not just specially for some people. And third, it has to be obligatory. But fourth, and this is the most important thing, it has to be either enforced or it has to be voluntarily adhered to. And what's striking about this election is the police proactively deployed during the election. That's enforcement for sure. And also this civil society engagement that Rachel talked about, which was a kind of an informal, voluntary enforcement of the law. And then I would add a third, and this is really where my question is. Both Kenyatta and Ruto stated publicly that they would go to The Hague to face their charges. That's extraordinary, because we had, in other words, no longer a vacuum in the rule of law in the world. It was that we have an international criminal court. And then thirdly, then Raila Odinga was probably, I don't know, and this is my real question, influenced by the fact that they had been indicted, and that may have influenced his decision to abide by the rule of law instead of inciting his followers to violence. I wanted to ask you if you think that possibility of indictment by the ICC may have had an influence on him.
Thank you. Let's take one more.
Sure. My name is Hemdat. I'm a Kenyan. I'm actually from Mombasa. I'm also an economist here working in Washington within international development, but I'm here as an independent person. I work just down at the World Bank. First of all, thanks for the United States Institute of Peace for hosting this event. It's very important that we sit and talk about what happened and how it happened. And I appreciate the discourse and the storyline that has been told here today. But I'd like to just add one critical element that we've talked about since 2007. Kenya's history of independence since '63, we've really had 2 major leaders up until 1997. And in 2002, we had very historic elections, and there was no violence there. And that was the change of the Moi era onto the Kibaki era. And the civil society that everybody's talking about, the religious leaders, the media, the discourse on the constitution and getting a new constitution, that started before 2007, and that has been going on for quite a while. So it's really nice to hear all these things, but it's been a very important element of the Kenyan society. About what happened in 2007 was a shock for us. It was not the norm. And the way that it comes out here, and from what the leaflets that I've seen outside, it kind of, even, what was this term that I just read? Post-election violence is very, it's kind of normal in Kenya. For us, it's not, and it's not a good thing to, sit and talk about it as it was. But I appreciate, I'm not being negative here, but I'm just being kind of constructive criticism. So that's that. And also, I'm very happy to be here, and I love the fact that we're talking about this, but the title of the talk in itself, Why Were Kenyan Elections Peaceful, kind of sends a tone of, democracy is rising, it takes time. It's been 50 years almost since we got independence. It just doesn't happen over time. So we'll have bumps, we'll have hiccups, so the kind of messaging would be a bit more maybe different. And my question is basically not related to what I said, but what happens now? Uhuru Kenyatta is ICC accusee or indictment. What is the engagement, or what do you think the Western discourse will be on how to deal with Kenya? And I think there's a Brookings talk on Thursday, which is going to be great to kind of hear what they have to say. But now we have this, so anyway, thanks, cheers.
Thank you. Let's spend a minute on the ICC, because both these questions obviously relate to it, and you guys touched on it some in your remarks, but some really interesting questions here. How much did this affect the leadership decision-making? John, you talked about that a little bit. I wonder if there are some alternative views on the panel. And Sam, you talked a little bit about the deterrent effect of the ICC as well. And so related to these two questions, I'm wondering how much of an impact you think that really was.
Start.
All right, thank you. I may not be precise in terms of determining whether the ICC effect impacted on the behavior and actions of Raila Odinga. What I can say is that just as you have already pointed it, the fact that the ICC process is alive in Kenya, even before the elections and even now, was a significant statement in terms of tackling impunity, the culture of impunity generally in Kenya. And that after the 2007-2008 process, there was a lot of discussion in Kenya about, especially at the political level, that this ICC process was a distant thing that may never be realized in the lifetime of most of them. But when the process went full circle within a very short time, to the point that we had fairly senior people in Kenya for the first time facing crimes against, facing the rule of law, that for me had an effect across the board. For leaders like, for example, Raila Odinga, obviously, his behavior was completely under the radar of everyone at that particular time, because he was the one who was contesting the elections. And so I'm sure knowing that there was vigilance across and that everybody was keen to see how he was going to behave, I don't rule out the possibility that Hague effect influenced his action. But what I'll mostly say is that Raila himself had an obligation to support some of the things he had fought for a long time. He fought for a new constitution for many years, and Kenya got a new constitution, and from that constitution, serious institutions were established, most importantly the judiciary and the Supreme Court. So from a personal point of view, I would have expected him to see how these institutions behave in his lifetime, and particularly if he's a victim of a process which these institutions are supposed to adjudicate. And so on that basis again, there was that burden of history and burden of having worked so hard to transform the politics of Kenya through a process that was like a new constitution, strong institutions like the judiciary and the Supreme Court. Going the other way around would have, I think, reduced his stature and possibly undermined his own belief in those ideals.
Let's let some other folks chime in on this because we want to make sure we get through a bunch of questions.
I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I can comment on whether or not Raila was influenced. I know, I mean, certainly the ICC changed a lot of the rhetoric and the tone of the elections, especially in that a lot of people felt, who supported Uhuru and even who didn't, felt like they were being told what to do, or there was sort of this international interference. And I think it definitely changed a lot of the conversation just within Kenya political debate about who people wanted to vote for and why. And it probably also raised the stakes a little bit had Uhuru and Ruto not won the election, because a lot of people really felt quite angry that they felt like there was a high level of interference in their own democratic choice for who to elect. I think Uhuru and Ruto have said that they'll go to The Hague. I'm not sure if those cases, how long those cases will remain valid for. There have been witnesses dropping out. And I can't really speak from sort of like a Western foreign policy perspective about how the engagement will go from here, but I certainly think it would be a mistake not to engage the government. I think that I guess the other question about why is it so remarkable to study a peaceful election, I think that there was post-election violence in 92 and 97 that was not so bad, and 2002 is also a case that deserves to be studied. It's a remarkable thing. It was the end of a dictatorship, and it was a peaceful transition to the person who Moi had not backed. He had backed Uhuru at the time. So I think that election also deserves to be studied, and I also think it's important to note that election-related violence is not a uniquely Kenyan problem. It's a problem around the world. Elections tend to be high-stakes games where people feel very invested in who wins and loses for a lot of reasons. And so when we see Kenya, which had post-election violence during its previous election, move towards a peaceful election this time, the more we can understand about that, I think Kenya has a lot of potentially lessons for other parts of the world. So I think it's also good to recognize when good things happen and not just when bad things happen.
Yeah, let's keep going with questions. Joanna, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Prey. I work for the Open Society Foundations. I think, the panel rightly mentioned the role that public confidence in the judiciary played. I'm wondering if you can comment on the current state. We've seen a real crisis in confidence, not just among elite civil society in Kenya, but broader, that, the decision of the Supreme Court was widely seen as pretty thin and weak, and has led to, really an unprecedented public outreach campaign by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I mean, I think it's a marvel to watch from this side of things, to see a Chief Justice of a Supreme Court sort of plead with the public. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that, and also, the potential impact for future elections, because that was such a key piece of this puzzle. and just along those lines, the AFRICOG petition to the Kenyan Supreme Court cited many technical and other problems with the IEBC and with the actual running of the election. So although it was peaceful, it was not a great election, technically speaking. So and confidence in the IEBC was also another key element. So where does that leave us now? If the public, if you agree with me that the public has lost a lot of this confidence, what next?
Thank you. Please.
I feel like she has just taken my words out of But my name is Barbara Gonga. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand, by doing my research in Kisumu, Kenya. I just want to say that, I really appreciate this discussion here and this talk here, and especially, the way it is centering on, the functioning of the structures and the institutions in Kenya, because I know that, that has been a problem. The problem of African countries is because most of our institutions do not function. And also the structures are very weak. But now, having said that, like I said, she just took my words out of my mouth. But a couple of things here. Talking about, the judicial system, it seems like, there's a confidence crisis. And because a lot of people are coming out, they are beginning to ask, how come, the decisions, like we had here a panel of 6 judges, and all of them, all of the 6 judges came out and said, they unanimously agreed. I think that was really a historical indication, because I have never, and I don't know if anybody has ever heard about that, they can say, in any country, where all the judiciary, even, in a country like the US, with such an advanced, democracy, the best democracy on earth, you always find out that at least there's going to be, one dissenting judge who will come out and say, okay, I don't agree with this to a certain point. And we are also anticipating that even within the ICC, there's going to be, one dissenting judge will come and say, this, to a certain extent, I do not agree with this. That was not the case with the Supreme Court in Kenya. So I would just like you to comment on that. And then the other thing is, I think this discussion is okay, but I have a feeling that we are focusing on the past, which is a great thing. I am much more interested to think about, okay, the elections were peaceful, democracy is picking up in Africa, Kenya has always been, a gleaming torch, for African countries and so on and so forth, and that's great, we are happy about that. But my question here is that if we look at what is happening now, I just came from Kenya, a couple of days ago, there is a lot of violence, sporadic violence in different parts of the country. What does that mean? If you try to point that, to the elections that everybody is coming out and saying, okay, there was no violence and so on and so forth. So it's just, I don't think anybody has answers. I would just like a comment on that. And then the other thing is that, what is your comment about, the high profile disengagement of, high-profile people, needless to say, Raila Odinga, Kalonzo Musyoka, Martha Karua. These are very high-profile people from different ethnic groups that, are just, really, really, really high-profile. But these people have really decided, to disengage themselves from any government doings, any government dealings, and so on and so forth. What does that talk about, the beginning to function of our structures, the beginning to function of our institutions? Because I think, government is an institution. Now, if you find out that, these people... I think we need to
wrap up, I'm sorry, because I just want to make sure we get some more questions. Thank you.
I just wanted just a comment on those 3 things. Thank you.
We'll try. But let's try to take one more as well, please.
Nathaniel Hurt from World Vision. The work that we do with youth, particularly youth empowerment work in Kenya, is perhaps the most sensitive and in some cases challenging work that we do, partially because youth are perceived as being particularly vulnerable to manipulation and mobilization. So when we do this on a large scale, people sometimes get a bit nervous, and it's also seen as political, even though the work is actually very explicitly non-political. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the role that youth specifically and initiatives aimed at youth, whether they were local initiatives, international initiatives, etc., played in the peaceful outcomes in the election.
Great. So a couple questions about judiciary and youth and some of the public disengagement. Jackie, and do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't have much to comment on in the youth. I heard a lot about the youth programs, and they seem very successful. I think there's much more to learn. But regarding the other questions, I would just say, moving forward, that the question of what constitutes accountability for Kenyan citizens is an important question to be answered by Kenyans. And so we all know that the ICC only scratches the surface in terms of accountability. There are many more actors in Kenya who might be at risk or be culpable or in the future who might be put under an umbrella of accountability. And so the question is, what kind of narrative, what kind of actions Kenyan citizens take going forward? How do they frame accountability? Do they look at the judiciary below the level of the Supreme Court, as well as looking at the Supreme Court, and really hold them to high standards? And then do they take actions? Do they take things in under their own umbrella? And I'm thinking of the protest last week. I know some of those citizens have been arrested, the pigs at Parliament. And I read the Constitution, and it seems like there are provisions in here for that kind of action. And so how do Kenyans respond in a situation where accountability is in question? I'm anxious to see that narrative going forward. I think that's a really, really important indicator of the rule of law and the extent to which that is going to pervade Kenyan society and move them forward. So,
Yeah, John, please.
Quick issue on the court question. I think from contextual point of view, it's very important to understand the almost miracle that Kenya's gone through over the last 5 years. The radical change that the country has undergone to actually start to create a judiciary and all kinds of other elements of the government which the public begins to trust. I mean, Parliament was sort of a very sort of closed, dark place prior to 2008. Kenneth Marinde comes in as a new speaker with the new government in 2008, and all of a sudden there's complete sunshine on the place. All of the parliamentary proceedings are now broadcast live. They're on radio, they're on television, all kinds of different things. And we've got a new understanding and sense in the Kenyan population about how all these elements work. And the same thing began to be true with the Supreme Court, especially when President Kibaki appointed an earring-wearing Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who has extremely sort of liberal ideas and views of jurisprudence, and it kind of changed the game for everyone. The decision that the Supreme Court made did have a lot of perceived weaknesses to it, and I perceived those myself. I do think that the court was handled a very weak case by the lawyers that served the court petition, and it was part of the reason why in the end the decision was probably as weak as it was, because it wasn't particularly handled very well. It's going to be a real question over the next few months and years as to how the court can sort of reassert the confidence that it had become vested in it by the public. It's clearly dinged at this stage. The Elections Commission has the same sort of issues associated with it based on a lot of the failures in the process, from the electronic collection of votes and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of sort of system and structural repair that's going to have to go on based on sort of the kind of confidence and faith that the public had prior to the election itself.
Rachel, Sam, youth judiciary issues?
Yeah, I think I think you guys have addressed a lot about the judiciary. I can quickly say that I think there's a big role played by youth initiatives, but not only ones that sort of came from outside. I know in the communities where we worked, when we started working, we partnered with a lot of local organizations. I actually know World Vision does that as well, I think, is that a lot of the groups that we work with are actually made of people who participated in the 07-08 post-election violence, really regretted it, and decided we need to find a way to get ourselves some money so that we're not so vulnerable to manipulation. And a lot of them have started small entrepreneurial activities really with the goal of preventing themselves and others from participating. And I think, as always, it's always hard to go into community and decide where to work and how to work, like what you're saying, some of the challenges that you face. But I think that always, if you can first sort of find out who's doing what already, and figure out how to support them to make it bigger and more effective, I think that's always the way to go. I think you also brought up issues of sporadic violence that happened after the elections, and of course before the elections there's also an increase in crime because people either were or weren't getting money from politicians. If they were, they could buy new weapons. If they weren't, they wanted to rob people because they didn't feel like they were getting enough money, and we saw that happening in some areas. But I think it's also really important to separate out violence that happens because of opportunities created for crime around an event like an election, and potentially after or just in general, versus the type of violence that we saw in 07-08, which was much more community-wide, people turning against their neighbors and things like that. I think there's sporadic violence pretty much everywhere in the world. There's sporadic violence in the US. We see a lot of it lately with gun violence. So I think it's really important to analyze what are different types of violence and what do they each mean. So yes, there was violence before and after the election, but how much of it was tied to community-wide tensions and actually to the elections versus how much of it was criminals taking advantage of different situations or just ordinary violence.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, let me just add quickly. At the moment, the confidence that existed, public confidence on the judiciary, the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, and I'll also add the Supreme Court is not the same. And I think one of you has pointed to that fact. And one of you also has asked what next after this. Let me say that despite all the weaknesses that might have been there in either the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission or even in the judiciary, what is important is how Kenya, Friends of Kenya, and everybody interested in the future of Kenya reacts to those weaknesses. The Supreme Court came up with a decision which inevitably was not going to please 100% of Kenya. One side was bound to be disappointed, and one side was going to be happy. And I mean huge populations of Kenyans. As we move forward, I think the critical thing is to work on the weaknesses of those commissions and those institutions with a view to empowering them and strengthening for the next election and for the next challenge. If we move now with the idea of condemning the judiciary, condemning the Electoral Commission, we will not have prepared Kenya for a better future. So I will encourage everyone who is critical about what happened to take note of the negative things and the weaknesses of those institutions, but at least pay more attention in fixing them in readiness for the next election. And I think even for the public disengagement of Martha Karua, Raila and others, I don't know whether they are fully disengaged. At least the Jubilee administration is still under formation. So I hope one time they might be involved. But I think for purposes of uniting Kenya and also building public trust in institutions, it's important for both sides of the divide, the Jubilee Code and everybody else who participated in the election, to remain Kenyan in terms of building the future. It doesn't matter now whether somebody lost or gained. My expectation will be Raila Odinga will be an important part of the future of Kenya, just as Uhuru and Ruto, Martha Karua and everybody else. To me, that is the bond that holds all of them together, and not the differences of the last election. I think all of them are Kenyans, and I believe they wanted to rule Kenya because they had an agenda, which if they cannot pursue directly because they have not been elected, at least they can pursue it indirectly by supporting the future of Kenya, in whichever form, including supporting those institutions. The ongoing violence, the underlying grievances, somebody asked what is going on. That reaffirms what I said earlier, that the agenda for reconciliation has to begin in a more sustained, and also, the top leadership of Kenya has to take reconciliation and national unity as a serious agenda, the same way they take security, the same way they take economics, education, and so on. It should no longer be something that is peripheral for others to do it. It should be a main agenda within the government of Kenya. And part of that, both in terms of peace and also addressing the grievances that have been in Kenya before, is to make sure devolution works. If devolution does not work in Kenya in the next 5 years, the challenges will be more than what we had in the past, because the expectation of Kenyans, the optimism brought about by the new constitution, the reconfiguring of political power, that one is rested with how devolution is going to roll out. And I think it will have a lot of bearing in the future stability and security in Kenya.
Thank you, John. And a quick word on youth
Just
issues.
a quick comment. We were asked about youth. That's been a huge issue and a very loaded one over the last few years in Kenya. As many of you may know, both USAID and the embassy itself have had sort of major investments in youth activities and youth programs. So that might be better sort of placed in a conversation offline with things. It's also been the case with the government that there are sort of equally large programs and a focus on that at that level as well. So it is a major focus of sort of every kind of big institution in Kenya at the moment. But I don't think we can kind of do justice to the question here.
Thank you. So we're going to wind up with these last two questions. Ask you to please try to keep it brief and limit yourself to one question. We'll start over here and then here.
Good morning. My name is Jay Altidore. I'm a Dean Research Fellow at George Mason University at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I'm just a small member. What we focus on is monitoring early warning indicators to prevent genocide in the African Great Lake region. This time we are focusing on Kenya. And I was very interested in the aspect of hate speech. I noticed some of you mentioned hate speech, and I was also interested to see how the NCIC was aggressively monitoring it and trying to levy some kind of against those, whoever was caught to be dealing with hate speech. They were acted upon very, very quickly. Now, I'm trying to find out what is a list that you guys have that to help you monitor hate speech. For example, if you say that, I know somebody said mass action is one thing that if a political leader says that it's going to cause people to just move somewhere and cause violence, and somebody else said they're coming to get us. So as you're monitoring hate speech, what do you go by? What kind of cheat sheet do you have to help you decipher that, okay, whatever is being said on the net is considered to be dangerous or hate speech?
Thank you.
My name is Ross Howard. I teach journalism at Vancouver College, and the rest of my identity will become obvious in the question. I'm interested in the panel's description of whether the media played a significant influence in the outcome of this election. As you know, much of the analysis after the 2008 post-election violence indicated that the media, particularly the indigenous language media, contributed significantly to the breadth and the depth of the incitement of violence. This led to both the Kenyan media and international media developers collaborating and bringing a number of programs to strengthen Kenyan media. Full disclosure, I was the external evaluator for a major program of media development conducted by Internews Network. So everybody knows this is not a set-up question, but nonetheless. I'm under the impression that that program and others like it had a significant influence on knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. I'm quite convinced it affected knowledge and attitudes in Kenya. And many of the high-level accomplishments that you speak of here, or at least the reconciliation that was achieved, seems to me to have been communicated to the public through the media. So did the media play much of a role this time, and was it different? Thank you.
Yeah, the quick answer is it did play a role in that it kind of kept itself quiet. I think the major influence on that was the fact that of the 6 named people for crimes against humanity, one of them was a radio journalist. And the ripple, it wasn't a ripple, it was a tidal wave that was sent through the Kenyan journalist and media community by the fact that it wasn't just a politician that was indicted for crimes against humanity. It actually was one of them, changed their entire perception of their role in it, what they should do, how they should handle it, and everything else. At that point, there may have been some kind of technical way, well, what do we need to know and how do we need to handle this? And that's where a lot of the foreign investment might have made a big difference. But the real issue was just the fear and the potential things that could happen to them following that indictment. It was a really big issue within Kenya. It allowed a lot of us that were working in that space to start to work with the institutions that did have a really, really bad negative reputation in that. I'm very close now at this point to a lot of the senior people in CAS FM, which was the employer for that particular, for Joshua Arpsang, who's now remains sort of indicted by the court. And a lot of us have sort of gained traction at those institutions and been able to work with them somewhat intimately over the years. So it's really been, I think the media was defanged in a lot of ways. There's some counter arguments to that. Michaela Wrong was writing blog posts for the New York Times where she basically accused the media of abandoning its responsibility entirely, and it wasn't holding the IEBC and all kinds of other parts of Kenya to account for what was going on because they were so afraid of being caught in maybe providing some sort of basis for violence or tension or whatever, that they were holding back too much. So I think they played their role in not trying to aggravate anything.
Let's let Jackie pick up on that point.
Yeah, John, it's interesting you mentioned that because I was struck by a phrase that was tweeted at some point after the election results were announced, and the phrase was peace lobotomy, that I think there was a response or a reaction or perception that the media and civil society in general, lost themselves, lost the greater cause of justice and fairness at the expense of for peace. And so I think that's an interesting question, is the media efforts and training and things, and how you can train media to be able to engage on processes of fairness and legitimacy and credibility of the electoral process without being perceived as generating violence in some way. I think it's a sticky issue. The other point I wanted to mention was social media, and my understanding was that it was a really sticky issue, that it was difficult for the NCIC and others to monitor social media, and so this is another thing I think that requires more effort in the future.
Most of the hate speech sort of migrated to online, did it not?
Yes.
Rachel, do you want to pick up on the hate speech question as well?
Sure, yeah. I think when it came to hate speech, I think asking to define it is a question that a lot of people have asked, and I think a lot of people are a bit confused about what it is. It wasn't defined quite clearly in a lot of ways. And there are also a lot of studies and work being done, and I can point you to some resources afterwards on different types of hate speech. What makes hate speech more or less dangerous? And how do you pick out the sort of most dangerous bits of speech that can actually lead to consequences and make sure you respond to those? On our end, what we did is really just pick particular areas and monitor the situation very heavily, and we looked at rumors and attitudes and behaviors to see how we could plug in. So we weren't so worried about the technical definition of hate speech, but more how people were reacting to information and what type of information was going on that could incite people to violence. But I do think there are different sort of degrees of hate speech, maybe that insult one group versus that talk about a threat to your own group. I think they have different levels of danger, and that there's a lot of interesting work being done on that.
Thank you. Sam, final word, and all this goes to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on a question Jackie raised at the beginning about the role of the private sector in Kenya in terms of peace. And I want to start by saying, from the engagement in the Kenyan Dialogue and Reconciliation process in 2008, the Kenya private sector, particularly the Kenya Private Sector Alliance and the associate institutions, they have been engaged one way or the other from then, but most importantly from 2012, January, to the time of the election, the Kenya Private Sector Alliance was running a media-based peaceful election campaign called Amani Kenya. And most of the things, or the adverts or messages that you saw on Kenyan television and newspapers and so on, was part of the contribution of the private sector to peace and reconciliation in Kenya. So they were also engaged in one or the other. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We do need to wind up today. Let me just wind up. So I think we're early in this discussion about the causes, but I hope we made some progress today. I'm sure the conversation will continue. So thank you very much for coming, and please join me in a round of applause for the panelists.